The Providence Municipal Court is a place where the city's heartbeat is measured in unpaid fines and overdue explanations. The morning sun cuts through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing above the worn wooden benches. In the gallery, a mother hushes a toddler, and a construction worker checks his watch, anxious to get back to the site. Judge Caprio sits at the helm, his demeanor calm, a seasoned captain navigating a sea of minor infractions. He adjusts his glasses, ready for the next name, expecting the usual parade of hardships and honest mistakes. But the heavy oak doors swing open with a little more force than necessary. Ethan Riley walks in like he owns the building, or at least has a lease on the air inside it. He's young, barely 22, dressed in a sharp blazer that costs more than the bailiff's car, paired with sunglasses he removes with theatrical slowness. He doesn't look for a seat. He looks for an audience. He strides to the defendant's podium before his name is even called, a smirk playing on his lips. The courtroom quietens, sensing a shift in the barometric pressure. Ethan Riley, the clerk, Ms. Jenkins, announces, her voice steady but carrying a hint of fatigue as she lifts a folder thick enough to be a novel. She peers over her reading glasses. Your Honor, we have a substantial list here. 3 counts of parking in a restricted zone, 2 counts of blocking a fire hydrant, and 4 failures to appear in response to court subpoenas. The gallery murmurs. Ignoring subpoenas is a bold move in Providence. Judge Caprio looks up, his eyes narrowing slightly, assessing the young man who stands not with contrition, but with a posture of bored superiority. Mr. Riley, Judge Caprio begins, his voice low and gravelly, the kind of tone that usually invites silence. That is quite a collection you've amassed. Ethan leans his elbows on the podium, invading the court space. Look, Your Honor, he interrupts, his voice loud and projecting to the back row. I know how this looks on paper. But before we get into the boring details of where my car was, I think you should know who I am. Or rather, who my family is. He pauses for effect, checking to see if the judge is impressed. My grandfather is General Thomas Riley. Perhaps you've heard of him. He commanded respect, and frankly, I'm used to a certain level of understanding when it comes to minor inconveniences like parking tickets. The air in the room stiffens. Judge Caprio doesn't blink. He doesn't look at the clerk or the bailiff. He just looks at Ethan, studying him like a map with a dangerous route marked in red. The name drop lands with a thud, not a splash. Ethan Riley didn't wait for the clerk to finish listing the docket numbers. He adjusted the cuffs of a blazer that likely cost more than the bailiff's monthly salary and leaned into the microphone, the feedback whining briefly like a protest. Before Judge Caprio could even invite a plea, Ethan's voice filled the room, smooth and practiced, completely lacking the tremor of nervousness usually found at the defendant's podium. Your Honor, before we get into these clerical misunderstandings, Ethan began, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, I think it's important for the court to understand the context of who is standing before you. My grandfather is General Thomas Riley. Perhaps you've heard of him? Distinguished Service Cross, 3 tours in Vietnam, a pillar of Rhode Island infrastructure. He paused, letting the name hang in the air like a VIP pass, expecting the gavel to lower in immediate deference. The courtroom shifted perceptibly. A few heads turned in the pews. The name Riley carried weight in the State House and the country club, a currency Ethan was clearly accustomed to spending to make problems disappear. He wasn't pleading guilty or not guilty. He was pleading importance. He looked around the room, checking to see if the magic words had taken effect. His posture relaxed, almost bored by the pedestrian nature of the proceedings. Judge Caprio sat perfectly still. His hands were clasped over the file, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. He had heard the name, of course. He respected the general deeply. But Frank Caprio had spent decades watching people try to trade on someone else's valor. He let the silence stretch, thick and heavy, until Ethan's confident smile began to twitch at the corners. The judge didn't look impressed. He looked patient, which was far more unsettling for a young man used to immediate capitulation. "I am well aware of General Riley's service to this nation," Judge Caprio said finally, his voice soft, but possessing the density of lead. "He is a man of discipline, a man who understands the weight of rules." The judge leaned forward slightly, peering over the rim of his glasses, his gaze locking onto Ethan. "However, Mr. Riley, the general is not the one standing at that podium today. You are." He tapped the stack of citations with a single finger, the sound distinct in the quiet room. "So, let's put aside the family tree for a moment. Regarding these charges, parking in a handicap zone, speeding in a school zone, and failure to appear. What is your position?" Ethan leaned his elbows on the mahogany podium, treating it more like a bar counter than a piece of judicial furniture. The courtroom air, usually thick with nervous humility, seemed to curdle around him. "Look, Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice carrying a casual boredom that grated against the wood-paneled walls. "The parking ticket on Thayer Street? I was there for maybe 3 minutes. I had important business to attend to. I can't be expected to circle the block for 20 minutes like everyone else when I have places to be." He waved a hand as if shooing away a fly. Judge Caprio remained still, his hands clasped over the case file, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his glasses. He let the silence stretch, a tactic that usually made defendants squirm, but Ethan merely checked his watch. "And regarding the speeding," Ethan continued, not waiting for a prompt. "I honestly didn't know the limit dropped there. It's a speed trap, everyone knows it." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Then came the pivot to the accuser. Ethan gestured vaguely toward the back of the room. "Officer Rodriguez." Frankly, he seemed confused. I tried to explain the situation, explain who my grandfather is, but he was just rigid. Probably just a rookie trying to make a quota, or someone who doesn't understand how things work in the real world. He was just doing his job wrong, plain and simple. It felt personal, like he resented my car. The audacity hung in the air. In Providence Municipal Court, people often pleaded ignorance, but rarely did they plead superiority. Judge Caprio's gaze shifted from the defendant to the citation in front of him, reading the officer's notes, which painted a very different picture. Ethan wasn't finished. "I mean, really, don't we have real criminals to catch? Being dragged here for a rolling stop is a waste of my time." He looked up at the bench, expecting a nod of camaraderie. Instead, he found Frank Caprio staring back with the impassive weight of 80 years of wisdom, the kind of look that precedes a storm. Judge Caprio pivots in his chair, shifting his attention from the young man's dismissive smirk to the quiet figure waiting by the bailiff's station. "Officer Rodriguez," the judge says, his voice dropping to a register that cuts through Ethan's ongoing commentary about bureaucratic incompetence. "Please step up." Officer Rodriguez approaches the podium. He is the antithesis of the defendant. Posture rigid, uniform pressed, hands clasping a notebook rather than gesturing wildly. He doesn't look at the general's grandson. He looks strictly at the bench. "Your Honor," Rodriguez begins, his tone steady and practiced. "At 11:45 p.m., I observed the defendant's vehicle, a black sedan, aggressively weaving through traffic on Elmwood Avenue. He was clocking 60 in a 35 zone, forcing a minivan to brake abruptly to avoid a collision." Ethan sighs loudly, leaning back against the railing and checking his fingernails, as if bored by a rerun. Caprio ignores the theatrics, gesturing for the officer to continue. When he finally pulled over, Rodriguez says, flipping a page in his notebook, "It wasn't an illegal spot. He mounted the curb and blocked the access ramp for the handicapped zone at the pharmacy. When I approached the window to request his license, Mr. Riley threw his wallet onto the dashboard and asked if I knew who his grandfather was before I could even state the violation. The courtroom murmurs. Speeding is one thing, but blocking a handicapped ramp is a specific kind of selfishness that turns a crowd against you instantly. Caprio raises a hand, silencing the gallery. "Let's see the tape," the judge says. The monitor on the judge's desk flickers to life, projected simultaneously for the room to see. The grainy dashcam footage tells a story that words couldn't quite capture. The black sedan cuts across 2 lanes without a signal, the taillights blurring. Then, the body cam perspective takes over. The audio crackles, but the voice is distinct, arrogant and loud. "Call the station," the recorded voice of Ethan Riley demands, a finger pointing in the officer's face. "Tell them General Riley's grandson is in a hurry." In the courtroom, the real Ethan Riley shifts his weight, the boredom slipping slightly from his face. The video freezes on the final frame, his luxury car straddling the blue lines of the handicapped zone, blocking the path completely. The evidence hangs in the air, heavy and undeniable. Judge Caprio removes his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose slowly. He looks at the frozen image of entitlement, then directly at the young man who thought his lineage was a license to endanger others. The silence stretches, thick with the weight of proven arrogance. The monitor fades to black, leaving the afterimage of Ethan's sports car straddling the handicap lines, burned into the room's collective memory. The courtroom settles into a heavy silence, the kind that usually precedes a verdict. But Judge Caprio isn't ready for a ruling yet. He's looking for something else, a pulse of conscience beneath the designer suit. He takes off his reading glasses, folding them slowly, the plastic clicking rhythmically against the mahogany bench. Ethan Riley stands at the podium, checking his manicure, his posture still screaming defiance, though the video evidence has clearly bruised his ego. "Mr. Riley," Caprio says, his voice dropping an octave, shedding the administrative tone for something more personal. "You've mentioned General Thomas Riley 3 times in the last 10 minutes. You wear that name like armor." Ethan straightens up, mistaking the observation for a compliment. A smirk tugs at the corner of his mouth. "He's a war hero, Your Honor. People in this city respect the name. They know what my family has built." "They respect the man," Caprio corrects gently, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And do you know why?" Ethan blinks, caught off guard by the Socratic turn. "Because he was in charge. He commanded thousands. He was a leader." "Because he served," Caprio says, leaning forward, his gaze pinning Ethan to the floor. "Because when a superior officer gave him an order, he didn't roll his eyes. When the law required a sacrifice, he didn't ask for an exemption." The judge gestures toward Officer Rodriguez, who stands stoically by the bailiff, hands clasped behind his back. "When you told Officer Rodriguez that he was just a beat cop who didn't know who you were you acting as the general's grandson, or just a young man with a fast car and a slow understanding of duty?" Ethan shifts his weight, his face flushing a dull red. The air in the room feels thinner, the fluorescent light suddenly too hot. He tries to pull the shield back up, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "I didn't mean it like that. I just meant, my family has important engagements. We don't have time for petty harassment over parking spots. The general wouldn't want his time wasted on this." Caprio's expression tightens. "Petty harassment? You think the laws your grandfather swore to defend are petty when they apply to you?" "I have a legacy to maintain," Ethan snaps back, his voice cracking slightly, defensive and cornered. "Legacy isn't what you're given, Mr. Riley," Caprio says, staring right through the young man's expensive lapels. "It's what you do when no one is watching. And right now, the only thing I see you maintaining is a sense of entitlement that the general would have court-martialed in a heartbeat." Judge Caprio places his hands flat on the mahogany bench, the wood polished by decades of rulings, much like the man himself. He looks at Ethan Riley, not with anger, but with a disappointment that feels significantly heavier than a gavel strike. The courtroom, usually a hive of whispered anxieties and shuffling papers, falls into a profound silence. Even the air conditioner seems to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict on character rather than the verdict on traffic code. "Mr. Riley," the judge begins, his voice dropping to that low, resonant register that commands the room without shouting. "You keep waving that name around like a flag. General Thomas Riley." The judge nods slowly, acknowledging the weight of the title, but not in the way Ethan intended. "I respect the rank. I respect the sacrifice, but you are making a fundamental error in your calculations." Ethan blinks, his posture stiffening as the shield of his lineage begins to crack. The judge leans forward, his eyes locking onto the young man with piercing clarity. "Your grandfather didn't wear those stars, so his grandson could double park on Thayer Street and laugh at a patrolman. He didn't command troops to create a world where his family gets a free pass. He wore that uniform to defend a system where no one is above the law. Not the general, and certainly not you." The words hit their mark with kinetic force. Ethan shifts his weight from one foot to the other. The expensive designer jacket suddenly looks a size too big, or perhaps he just feels smaller inside it. The smirk that had been plastered on his face since the arraignment begins to dissolve, the edges curling inward, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. He glances toward the exit, but there is no retreat from the truth. Caprio continues, his tone relentless but calm, stripping away the young man's defenses layer by layer. "Honor isn't a trust fund, son. You cannot withdraw it from a bank account you didn't fill. It is a currency you have to mint yourself every single day, by how you treat the person sweeping the floor or the officer writing you a ticket." The judge pauses, letting the lesson hang in the fluorescent light like a physical weight. When you use his service to dodge your own responsibility, you aren't honoring his legacy, you are spending it. For the first time, Ethan looks down at his hands, the bravado drained away, leaving just a young man realizing he has brought a resume to a character inspection and failed. The air in the courtroom grows heavy, possessing the kind of density that usually precedes a harsh verdict. But Judge Caprio isn't looking at the docket anymore. He takes off his glasses, setting them gently on the mahogany bench, a gesture that signals the suspension of legal procedure and the beginning of a lesson. "Let me tell you about a gentleman who stood right where you are, just last week," Caprio says, his voice dropping an octave, forcing the room to lean in to catch the words. 92 years old. He struggled to walk to the microphone. He was wearing a faded jacket, not designer clothes. The judge recounts the interaction with cinematic clarity. The old man had been cited for an expired meter while picking up heart medication. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he didn't mention his rank or his sacrifices. He simply apologized for the oversight and reached for his worn leather wallet to pay. It was Inspector Quinn, standing by the bailiff's desk, who had to whisper to the judge that the man was a decorated hero from the Battle of the Bulge, a soldier who had carried his wounded sergeant 2 miles through deep snow under enemy fire. "He didn't tell me who he was to get out of a $20 fine," Caprio continues, his eyes locking onto Ethan's defensive posture. "He didn't use his medals as currency. He respected the law he fought to preserve." The contrast lands like a physical blow. Ethan Riley, who has spent the morning brandishing his grandfather's rank like a weapon, suddenly looks very small against the backdrop of that phantom veteran. "That man understood that the uniform isn't a VIP pass," Caprio adds, the warmth in his voice replaced by unyielding steel. "It is a heavy coat of responsibility. Your grandfather wore that coat. You are merely holding on to the receipt, expecting a refund on his behalf." The gallery remains motionless. The hum of the ventilation system seems to stop. For the first time, the smirk that has plastered Ethan's face since he walked in begins to fracture, replaced by the dawning realization of just how hollow his entitlement sounds in a room that honors substance over status. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to vanish, leaving the courtroom in a vacuum of sudden gravity. Judge Caprio placed both hands flat on the bench, a deliberate gesture that signaled the end of the debate and the beginning of the judgment. He looked at Ethan Riley, not with the anger of a magistrate, but with a profound disappointment that weighed heavier than any fine in the Rhode Island statutes. "Young man," Caprio said, his voice dropping to that quiet, resonant register that commands absolute silence from the gallery. "In the last 20 minutes, you have mentioned General Thomas Riley's name 5 times. You have used it like a shield to deflect responsibility, and you have brandished it like a weapon against Officer Rodriguez." Ethan opened his mouth to retort, his instinct to fight still active, but the judge held up a single finger. "No, you are done talking. Now you listen." Judge Caprio leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the young man. "Your grandfather commanded thousands. He earned respect by giving it, by serving something greater than himself. You are standing here, hoping his shadow is long enough to hide your mistakes. But let me tell you something about this courtroom. Shadows don't work here. Only the truth does." The judge paused, letting the words sink into the expensive fabric of Ethan's hoodie, stripping away the layers of privilege. "I want you to look at that flag behind me, the one your grandfather saluted every morning. If he walked through those doors right now, not the legend, but the man, and saw his grandson mocking the law he risked his life to defend, tell me, Ethan, would he be proud?" The air left the room. Ethan Riley, for the first time since entering the building, looked small. The smirk that had been plastered on his face since the docket was called finally dissolved, revealing a sudden, stark vulnerability. He looked at the flag, then down at his hands, and finally, he really looked at the judge. The entitlement drained away, leaving just a young man realizing he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "No," Ethan whispered. The silence stretched. He cleared his throat, the bravado completely extinguished. "No, Your Honor. He wouldn't." He took a shaky breath, his posture slumping. I was wrong. I was disrespectful to the officer and to this court. I'm sorry. Truly." It wasn't a strategic apology designed to lower a fine. It was the sound of a boy forced to become a man under the crushing weight of shame. Judge Caprio watched him, searching his face for the lie, but found only a reluctant, painful truth. The silence in the courtroom isn't empty. It is heavy, filled with the echo of a young man's first real moment of humility. Ethan Riley stands at the podium, shoulders finally slumped, the invisible epaulets of his grandfather's rank no longer holding him up. Judge Frank Caprio watches him over the rim of his glasses. He has sat on this bench for decades, watching the parade of human error, and he knows the difference between a performance and a realization. "Ethan," the judge says, dropping the formal Mr. Riley for a moment. The voice is soft, the kind a grandfather uses when the lesson is hard but necessary. "I accept your apology. I believe that right now, in this minute, you understand the disrespect you showed, not just to this court, not just to Officer Rodriguez, but to the memory you claim to cherish." The judge picks up his pen, hovering it over the docket. The scratching sound it makes is the only noise in the room. "But words are cheap, son. Actions are the currency of the law. You cannot inherit character. You have to build it, brick by brick." Caprio looks down at the total sum of fines. It is a significant number. "I am going to remit the court costs. I am dismissing the penalties for the late response because you are here now and you are facing the music. Ethan breathes out, a sharp, shaky sound. However, Caprio continues, the steel returning to his tone. The fines for the handicap parking and the moving violations remain. You will pay them in full. But money is easy. I want something more valuable from you. The judge leans forward, clasping his hands. I am sentencing you to 50 hours of community service, and I am specifying the location. You will serve these hours at the Rhode Island Veterans Home. A murmur ripples through the benches. It is a poetic sentence. You want to trade on the general's name? Caprio asks, his eyes piercing. Go change the sheets for men who served with him. Go pour coffee for women who sacrificed their youth for the freedom you used to block a sidewalk. Learn what service means when there are no medals involved, only duty. Ethan nods, his face pale but set. I will, Your Honor. We'll see, Caprio says, signing the paper with a final flourish. Review in 90 days. Don't let them down. The final pen stroke on the docket sheet sounds like a gavel in the hushed room. The fines are set, the community service assigned, but the transaction isn't quite finished. Judge Caprio places his hands flat on the bench, the wood polished by decades of similar moments. He looks over his glasses, not at a defendant, but at a young man who has just been stripped of his armor. Ethan Riley stands alone now. The ghost of the general isn't hovering behind him to intimidate the court anymore. Instead, the memory of the grandfather waits to be properly honored. Mr. Riley, Judge Caprio says, his voice losing the sharp edge of the interrogation and settling into the warm, gravelly tone of a grandfather. You walked in here thinking your lineage was a VIP pass. You thought the name Riley meant you didn't have to follow the rules. The judge pauses, letting the hum of the ventilation fill the silence. But the irony is, your grandfather fought for a country where no last name is heavier than the law. Every time you use his rank to escape a ticket, you aren't honoring him. You are undoing his work. Ethan looks down, staring at the scuffed floor tiles. For the first time, the silence isn't defiant. It's reflective. Caprio continues. True legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you build. When you go out there to perform your service, when you help the veterans at the center, I want you to listen to them. They didn't have generals for grandfathers. Many had nothing. But they gave everything. Don't wear his name like a badge of immunity, Caprio concludes, offering a small, hopeful smile. Wear it like a standard you have to reach. Be the man he hoped you would be, not the exception he never asked for. Good luck, son. Ethan nods, a slow, genuine movement. Thank you, Your Honor, he murmurs. He turns from the bench. The strut is gone. He walks past Officer Rodriguez and offers a tentative, respectful nod. The officer nods back. As the heavy oak door closes behind Ethan, the air in the courtroom feels lighter. Judge Caprio checks his watch, then looks to the clerk. Who's next, Inspector? The world keeps turning, one lesson at a time.